Hello and welcome. Uh, Today, our topic is school bullying and how it fuels a culture of hate. We focus on schools in California, the state with the largest and most diverse youth population in the country. What our speakers share, we hope will resonate with reporters across the country. We will be doing follow-up briefings on this topic in other parts of the country. Bullying in school seems almost an inevitable part of coming of age. Youth who are victims of bullying or have bullied others are often hesitant to share their experiences and seek help in healing. But the impact of bullying can last for years, even decades. At a time when racial and ethnic relations are on edge and ever more polarizing, with social media posts encouraging anonymous cyberbullying, our briefing today will examine what's happening with bullying in schools, who the prime targets and perpetrators are, and how learning about youth bullying provides insights we otherwise might not realize about race and ethnic relations, at least among the young in our state. Young people, especially those on the margins, are where the energies of the culture tend to move. In my years of working in youth communications, I've come to see youth as who we are becoming. How do the racial and ethnic conflicts in the schools plant the seeds for a culture of hate in the future? Our speakers today barely do justice to the complexity of the topic because we can't go for more than an hour. And I am so thankful to them for taking this topic on and look forward to tapping them for follow-up briefings. We want to thank the California Civil Rights Department and the State Libraries Stop the Hate Initiative for supporting this work. Our speakers include Becky Monroe, Deputy Director, Strategic Initiatives and External Affairs, California Civil Rights Department. Dashka Slater, New York Times journalist and author of 2 books, including the recently released Albany High School District. Actually, the title is Albany, Unpacking Albany's Racist Instagram Scandal. Anay Santos, Youth Wellness Coordinator for One Community Action, which works in the high schools of Santa Maria in the Central Coast. Ms. Santos is 21. Mina Fedor, founder and executive director of AAPI Youth Rising, a coalition of young people working to address the rise in hate crimes. Ms. Fedor is a sophomore in high school. Connie Alexander, president of the Santa Barbara NAACP, longtime educator and professional career consultant. We had also included Barbara Risling, a veteran organizer, member of the Hupa and Yurok tribes in Siskiyou. And unfortunately, she just called us to tell us that one of the young people in her program is having a crisis, so she will not be able to join us this time. We ask speakers to speak slowly, as I'm doing, so our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean can keep pace. And we ask reporters to enter questions in the chat, which we will take up after each of our presenters has completed their presentation. We will send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios, with contact information for all our speakers to all participants today. And now for our first speaker, Becky Monroe. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Monroe.
Thank you so much. And I really want to thank Ethnic Media Services and all of the reporters here from Ethnic Media Outlets. At the Civil Rights Department here in the state and through California versus Hate, we recognize that you are serving many of the communities we are privileged to serve and that we want to reach. So we are grateful for your coverage of critical civil rights issues like the one we are addressing today. I am particularly honored to be a part of this panel of speakers, many of whom are the community leaders we are fortunate enough to work with, to learn from, and to combat hate. And I particularly, because I've had the chance to work with Mina at API Youth Rising and the NAACP Santa Barbara branch, I just want to highlight the importance of hearing, of everyone hearing their voices and their experiences. They are seeing things that we all need to know more about. I'm also, as a part of my remarks, I want to share some thoughts from colleagues at Equality California. They were not able to join today because of scheduling conflicts, but they have important perspectives that we want to make sure you hear. And they are also available for follow-up interviews if you would like to speak with them. One of the things I want to emphasize today at the beginning of this conversation is that some forms of bullying are in fact acts of hate. And some acts of hate are crimes, while others are violations of other civil rights laws. Some may be lawful, but incredibly harmful nonetheless. We must recognize the civil rights issues at the heart of this discussion around bullying. All of these demand our attention, whether they are acts of hate targeting young people or targeting adults, but none so more than when children are targeted for hate. California and federal law very clearly require that schools provide all students with a safe, supportive, and inclusive learning environment, free from discrimination and harassment. Schools have a legal obligation to ensure that students are not denied opportunities, treated differently, discriminated against, or harassed because of their race, color, national origin, gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, or disability. Schools must have policies and procedures to prevent and address harassment based on protected characteristics and must ensure equal opportunity for all students. One of the reasons I was particularly honored to be on this panel with these experts is that they are going to speak not only to the legal rights of young people, but to the real harm that unlawful discrimination and other acts of hate have on young people and on entire communities. Empirical research demonstrates that acts of hate inflict substantial harm on students and their school communities, causing physical and emotional harm. It should also be noted, and you're going to hear more about this later, that people living at the intersection of two marginalized social identity groups that confront discrimination are particularly at risk for real harm. And I'm thinking, and you're going to hear more about the experience, for example, of Black or Asian young women or other people of color who are LGBTQ. We have to pay attention. When we're talking about these civil rights violations, we really are talking about, in some cases, matters of life or death. One of our colleagues who was not able to join us today because of a scheduling conflict was Equality California. Equality California is an organization that fights for LGBTQ rights. I asked for their permission to share some information from one of their recent press releases because I think it carries information that if you're covering this issue, it is important to know. They quoted their executive director, Tony Huang, regarding anti-LGBTQ protests, which have led to the outbreak of violence at school board meetings. And here he's referring to one specific school board meeting in early June. He said, and I quote, "Over the past several months, school board meetings across the country have been turned into arenas for anti-LGBTQ political propaganda. Sadly, this is also happening in California. He continues, quote, "It is not a coincidence that this happened on the same day that the Human Rights Campaign declared a national state of emergency for LGBTQ+ people in response to a flurry of anti-LGBTQ+ legislation, as well as a rising tide of anti-LGBTQ+ sentiment. Data from our partners at the Trevor Project shows that students that feel supported and safe in school are much less likely to experience suicidal ideation and engage in self-harming behaviors. It is disturbing that these acts of anti-LGBTQ+ violence are occurring on school property." And I'm going to finish my quote there. I wanted to raise this because it is something we are seeing. I was just talking to the chair of the Civil Rights Council for the Civil Rights Department about how concerning it is that we are seeing students being targeted sometimes by other kids' parents at these school board meetings for acts of hate. So in addition to noting the devastating harms that acts of hate can have on students, I also wanted to highlight something else that you heard there. When there is tension and an increase in acts of hate in the greater community, it will be reflected in schools and among students as well. That may sound sort of self-evident, but I think it is important to note that we have to pay special attention to what is happening among young people, because as we see, and as Sandy opened the meeting explaining, we know there is an increase in tension, an increase in the potential for acts of hate targeting so many of our communities, and this will be reflected in school. This is part of the reason that we developed California versus Hate, the resource line and network that we have through the state of California, in the way that we did. We wanted to make it safe and easy for people of all ages to report acts of hate and get support. I very quickly want to remind everyone here, because when you're covering these stories, I know it is important to show there are resources to support people. So I want to quickly let you know again what we can do at California versus Hate. We are the first statewide resource line and network for people targeted for hate in our state. There are three main goals. One is we want people to know their options if they are targeted for hate. You do not have to be a legal expert, know exactly if what happened to you was a violation of the criminal code or the civil code, or even if it was lawful but still caused harm. All you have to know is that you were targeted for discrimination, or if you are an organization that is serving other people, that you are working with someone who is targeted for some form of discrimination because of who they are, and we can provide you with culturally competent resources and support. People can call or go online to get that support.
So, Becky, I have to ask you to wrap up.
Okay.
There's great comments. Do you have a final?
I'll just let you know, sure. So I just want people to know if they reach out, they can both get resources, they can get care coordination services, which means someone can be assigned to them to help. And I think in conclusion, I just want to say, I'm particularly grateful you're going to be hearing from other leaders on this call, because in addition to helping us understand the harm of hate, they also help us understand the power of young people and solidarity across different communities, and the power of truth telling. I have seen students and teachers who reject white supremacist efforts to divide our communities and demand equal rights for all. They remind us of our common humanity and our shared interest in fighting for each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Becky, there are a number of questions in the chat. I hope you'll be able to monitor and perhaps address some, because we always run out of time, and these questions are so important. Our media are going to be doing stories as a collaborative effort to really probe what the bullying landscape looks like in their own communities. So this, in a way, is very important foundational knowledge. We go now to our next speaker, and very glad to have her, Dashka Slater, whose book I just mentioned documents a very important case in Albany School District that grew out of a particularly severe incident of cyberbullying. Ms. Slater, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I just wanted to quickly show the covers of my books. This book is actually called Accountable, the book about Albany, the true story of a racist social media account and the teenagers whose lives it changed. And I've spent 10 years working on books about teens and bullying and hate. This previous book is The 57 Bus, which tells the story of a young non-binary person who was set on fire on a public bus. And both books look at the origins and the impacts of the stories that they tell, the cases that I followed. And so I want to just talk kind of briefly about the story of Accountable, because I think it's instructive of what kinds of things we're seeing. I travel around speaking to schools and mostly middle and high schools, and I always ask, what are you seeing in your school? And it's so prevalent. What happened in Albany was that a young Korean American student, junior, created a racist social media account on Instagram, and it was sort of generally racist with images of lynchings and use of the N-word and other slurs, but it was also specifically racist towards Black girls at the school who were actually the creator of the account's friends. There were a total of 14 followers, including the creator of the account, and there were about 10 students who were targeted, most of them Black girls, but there was also sort of generic body shaming, and there was an anti-Semitic post, and there was one South Asian boy who was targeted for the color of his skin. So this account, when it was revealed, kind of blew up the whole community. The girls who were targeted felt particularly betrayed and hurt because this was not only targeting them and their identities, but it was also coming from people that they had trusted, whose house they had slept over at and were going to go to prom with. And so it was a very deep betrayal and a massive rupture in the community that ended up sort of having one thing after another happen, including a demonstration at school that devolved into violence. One of the people who followed the account had his nose broken. Parents were surrounded in their cars. Things got very out of hand. There were subsequent lawsuits with over free speech. And it was all in all like a terrible rupture for everybody involved, and revealing, I think, of it, while things got much more extreme in the aftermath of the account itself was something that I hear happen constantly. And so I just want to give you a few statistics because I want to talk a little bit just about what is happening online. 3 in 4 American young people ages 15 to 25 have run into extremist content online. And about half of that extremist content focuses on race or ethnicity. This invariably bleeds into real life. 1 in 4 students aged 12 to 18 have seen hate or words or symbols written in their schools. And about 1.3 million students were bullied because of some aspect of their identity during the 2018-19 school year, which is the last year that we have full statistics from. That comes from a USGAO report. So these are all national rather than California statistics. Of those 1.3 million students who were bullied, about half of those were targeted because of their race. And so we're seeing that race is the sort of preponderance of the identities that are targeted, but we also see big chunks of kids who are targeted because of being somewhere in the LGBTQIA plus umbrella. About 1 in 4 of those kids have been physically assaulted, and 77% of trans kids have been harassed at school. So this is an enormous landscape of things that are targeting students for their identity. But I want to remind you a couple of things, because it's very easy to feel like these are bad racist kids who are doing this, or bad transphobic kids, or whatever. But the thing that we need to know is that they are often kids who aren't even that dialed into to bigotry. They are not necessarily people who would say, I believe in X racist or transphobic or, whatever it is idea. They are often following the lead of a more biased peer, and they're imitating things that they are seeing on social media. So, and it's also probably wise to remember that many kids are playing both roles. So, we often see kids of color who are also, harassed for their identity and harassing somebody else for their identity. And the studies show that kids who play both roles, who are both the bully and the bullier, the bullied and the bullier, are the ones who have the most intense and intractable long-term effects, which I think is interesting. So where is this coming from? It's coming both from online things that kids are seeing. We know that there are extremist groups that are very carefully and thoughtfully targeting young people, creating racist memes and videos that in their extremist channels, and then migrating those into mainstream channels where kids run into them and often don't have the critical skills to be able to analyze what they're seeing. And so take that to mean that this is an acceptable kind of humor, that it's not serious, that it doesn't mean anything, it doesn't create any lasting harm, it's not bullying, it's just joking. And this is a really important point, because what I saw in Albany was that many of the kids who followed the account considered themselves to be anti-racist. And this insane disconnect between what they were doing and who they thought of themselves as being was something that they had not themselves explored and was very misunderstood. And so we have to be aware that kids are being radicalized online and often just don't understand what's happening. And as the algorithms serve them up more and more extremist content, they get kind of steeped in it and don't realize what is happening, how they are being changed by that. What we see is also, of course, anything that's in the news. People are getting it from their family. We just heard about school board meetings and those kinds of things. So absolutely, when those ideas are around them in the family context, in the news, those kinds of things, it trickles down into schools and kids act out whatever the adults are doing. But it can also happen when kids are in very liberal places and very liberal families that would consider themselves places that would never happen. And it does happen frequently because of what's happening online.
Thank you. Ms. Slater, I need to ask you to do a final wrap up.
Okay. The last thing I just want to talk about, and I think other people are going to talk about the impacts of this. So I just want to talk about the response. Schools tend to rush to their disciplinary codes and say, we are going to deal with this. We have, rules about cyberbullying or bullying. And that really falls short of what needs to be done. And so one of the things that roles that the media can play is to not amplify the sort of rush to punishment as the answer, And because schools often need time to investigate, they need to make statements affirming their values. They need to be supporting the victims and not think that their work is done when once they've punished the perpetrators. And they need to fulfill their mission of teaching, which means media literacy for students, helping students understand and identify when racist or other bigoted tropes are coming towards them on social media. Thanks.
Ms. Slater, thank you so much. We will be sending out references to all the collateral information like your latest book, and we're so grateful you're on the call. Please stay on as we go to our next speaker, and we welcome Connie Alexander, president of the NAACP in Santa Barbara, a longtime career consultant in the school district. Ms. Alexander, please.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. So, the position I'm going to speak out of today is as president of a specific unit. So we're in Santa Barbara. I appreciate what Ms. Slater just said about the fact that sometimes we think of some communities as, oh no, that's a liberal community. That's this community. That would never happen there. But it's in those very places around our state that we are experiencing this. The state, California DOJ, their annual reports that say who is the most harmed. In those reports, it tells us that Black African-American people are still experiencing those highest levels of hate, and that our youth are still experiencing the highest levels of hate. When I think about what's happened in our own community, in the Santa Barbara community, I can tell you that some of this is not what people would expect. We are often positioned in a way that says, oh, but they're so small. That's literally how people start the conversation, really. Like, oh, but there's not that many, but that many are still being harmed. And that's the position of what has to be looked at in this way. So we have had a series of events, and actually it goes way back in Santa Barbara, where community, Black African-American community has been harmed. Santa Barbara County, Black African-American people make up about 2% of the population. So that gives you an idea of then what does it look like in our school district. So that means in our school district, those that identify, it's somewhere between 100 to 300, probably that are Black African-American or Black biracial, okay, in those districts. But when you think about what the reporting looks like of like who's being harmed, it's a very high number. So I could speak personally about some situations that we have had happen in the last year and a half that have been particularly painful. But I want to make sure you understand it's all connected to generational pain in our area. So we had last spring 2022, a young man was assaulted at our local junior high. Now, this was an assault between racial groups, which happens to be the #1 situation that we have. The violence is the violence of language is where it starts. So a pervasive calling of the N-word by young Latino students to Black African-American students. That's the highest thing. It's every day, it's weekly. It has moved itself into physical violence. And so this young man was assaulted, thrown to the ground. He was beaten up. The boys jumped on him, jumped on his neck, and chanted George Floyd. So that, and the repercussions of that, it kind of blew up. It blew up in the community. People wanted to know how it was going to change. I could tell you to this day that that family still has not received any of what was coming to actually resolve the situation. It took 5 months for that young man to even get a mental health check-in, to even be able to see a therapist, and what that mom has gone through. Just last week, one of our youth, same junior high, was assaulted, same kind of situation. They weren't chanting George Floyd, but he was jumped coming out of a PE class and beaten up. And it was the same racial profile, where we had Black African-American students and Latino students. So right now, that is the cusp of much of what's happening in California. And it's connected to, and you must understand that the erasure of Black people in California. So it's a part and it's really connected to that. And I want people to understand the connection of that erasure, that somehow or another, in an effort to move towards more, I don't know, white facing, more white upstanding, one group has said this group needs to not be here so that we have an approximate, that we can be more approximate to what is white. And that's really what's happening in our schools. So how are schools dealing with it? You know, Santa Barbara Unified did a huge racial climate survey. It's public. Parents, everybody got into it, teachers, everybody talking about it. But now is the hardest part, because now something actually has to come from it. The NAACP in California supported Senate Bill AB 1145. I think it's 1145, that really said, this is what has to happen after all of these things do. So school districts that say, we don't know what to do after, nope. The legislature has outlined for them, this is what you have to do. And in fact, it even says in there that they now have to go back to these youth and make sure that they are in a much better place, and they have received a check-in, mental health services, something that has never been in there before, because we see the long-term impact to these young people and what's happening. So the origins of this is that breakdown between communities. And for me, NAACP leader in a predominantly Hispanic community, I know this is where the struggle really is how do we have community leaders from the Hispanic community, Latino community, Black community? We have to actually sit down and have our own conversations. Has it happened? No, it has not happened. And the push for that, because again, what supports it not happening is the erasure culture that says, no, we don't really need to talk about that. Oh, it was just a single incident, but it is a constant. One young man has been so harmed on a regular basis. We are actually considering what we can do. We might even walk him to school because he's just experienced so much harm. Another Black parent and family, they took their daughter out of the school system. They didn't even let her go to the high school. They're trying to figure out how to do independent study, because in her junior high, every single day, she was called the N-word. Every single day. So you must understand that relationship to mental health, to the high rate of Black youth's attempts at suicide. So it's 10% of Black youth at some point might consider suicide or attempt, versus 4.5% of white youth. So think about numbers like that. Think about the impact that this regularly has and the harm. So we're happy to participate with California Stop the Hate. It is absolutely needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Alexander. I know that there will be many questions. All our speakers, thank you so much for monitoring and responding when and how you can. Our next speaker is from Oakland, Mina Fedor, founder and executive director of AAPI Youth Rising and a sophomore in high school. Mina, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to speak alongside all these other amazing people who are doing such great work in their communities. And I'm really honored to be here. Yeah, so again, I'm Mina. I'm currently a sophomore in high school, and I go to school in Oakland. And I'm joining you at lunch right now. So excited to be here, and nice to see you, Becky. And also, yeah, I'm very excited to speak alongside all these other amazing people. So I founded AAPI Youth Rising around a year it was, I think, over 2 years ago now. It's been quite a while. But our mission is to advocate for Asian American youth. And we believe that we can make a difference by taking small actions in our communities. And some of our main goals are to advocate for inclusive education, promote safer and healthier communities, and also unite against all forms of hate through coalition building, civic engagement, and raising our youth voices. But a bit of an introduction. I first experienced, witnessed, and started to understand xenophobia at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. My school in Berkeley, California, when I was in middle school, was one of the first schools in the whole state to actually go into lockdown. And at the time, many elders and Asian American youth were also being targeted. I heard comments about bat soup and kung flu and felt very unsafe in my identity as being Asian American. So I decided to speak out about the xenophobia that I had witnessed and that my other friends had been very deeply affected by, and how Asians were being blamed for a virus that does not discriminate. So I organized a small community gathering at Berkeley's Aquatic Park, hoping for only 70 attendees, and instead over 1,200 people ended up showing up for the AAPI Youth Rising rally. And that day I realized that I could make a difference by taking these small actions, and that people actually wanted to hear some of these perspectives of youth, and specifically Asian American youth. And I realized that our perspective needs to be out there. So that's when we formed AAPI Youth Rising.
Mina, could you speak a little more slowly for our interpreters?
Yes, I can. Thank you. Sorry, I talk kind of fast sometimes. And
That's
yeah.
right. You're doing fine.
But before I get more into some of the work that AAPI Youth Rising is trying to accomplish, I think it's important to note that the AAPI experience is extremely diverse, and we are in no way, shape, or form a monolith. We represent 50 ethnic groups speaking over 100 languages and many different generations and mixed cultures. And although I live in a progressive community, like the previous speaker and the speaker before her also stated, the hate here and the hate even in progressive areas, or quote unquote more, I don't know, liberal areas, is still very real and very much experienced intensely, especially within the school system. And I went to middle school in Berkeley and still heard all kinds of comments making fun of Asians almost on a daily basis. And it was just sort of a normalized thing to have that hate all around you.
Mina, could I interrupt you and ask you to share your experience as seeing this kind of bullying coming from within the Asian community, targeting Asians as well?
Yeah, I think there have been a lot of, even my little brother right now, he's currently in 7th grade, around the time that I started noticing and experiencing those kinds of things. And a lot of it is actually like Asians and Asian students making fun of other Asian students and trying to bring down other AAPI groups to seem like they can fit in more, or it's just seen as kind of a big joke that people sort of adhere to. And I think that's a big problem that needs to be addressed, specifically that a lot of the hate that I see sometimes is from AAPI students to other AAPI students. So that's another thing that I wanted to recognize. But there's a lot of hate that also happens online where teachers can't see it, and where kids feel empowered to say bigger and bolder and more frightening things, like what Dashka Slater reported on in her article. A lot of this hate happens online, and that needs to be recognized as well. But comments like "go back to where you come from" and "where are you really from," and those that target our sense of belonging in this country all stem from the same idea, and the idea that we are perpetual foreigners. We are cast as model minorities that are too successful, and these stereotypes are being reinforced by those in power, and to keep us in a lower place, and to sort of put Asian Americans into a box and not let us, I don't know, freely express ourselves or do the things that we want to do. So also a lack of representation in media and our not being represented in our history books is very harmful, because our stories aren't being told as they should be. And COVID-19 has brought up a lot of these issues, and brought a lot of these issues forward that have existed in this country ever since we got here, and ever since forever now. But COVID-19 really amplified a lot of these issues and is making a lot more people aware of these so that we can address them.
Thank you. I'm going to have to ask you to hold on until we have our final Q&A, but that was very, very helpful. I am going to go to our last speaker, and we are joined by Anay Santos, a 21-year-old youth wellness coordinator at One Community Action in Santa Maria on the Central Coast. Anahí, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Well, my name is Anay Santos. I am Youth Wellness Coordinator here at One Community Action in Santa Maria Valley, which is in the Central Coast of California. And really what I want to give you all an insight in is how many of the speakers mentioned of how strong that bullying comes from our own community. So I am a Mixteca from the state of Oaxaca in Mexico. And so in my state, we are predominantly indigenous. And so we do migrate to California. A majority of us migrate to California. And what we see here is that the Latinos are bullying people who are indigenous, youth who are indigenous, but also like youth who come from Oaxaca or from Guerrero or from another, or who are themselves indigenous, are also bullying their peers, right? That are coming from the same town as them, that are coming from the same state as them. And so that is really strong here in California, specifically in the Central Coast and the Central Valley. I've lived in both places, and you can even see that like local gangs are so segregated like that, right? Where you have a gang on the north side of town being, you know, like with white complexity, but are still Latinos. And then the gangs on the south side of the city are predominantly indigenous or brown, or sometimes like Black. And so we see that in schools where, you know, it's easier being a bully than it is being bullied, right? In our communities, like at the age of 12, we're already worrying about being like the main caretaker in our, you know, in our family, having to take care of siblings, having to work during the summers, or sometimes even, you know, asking days off during the week to work and provide for our families, right? And so when I say that it's easier being the bully than it is being bullied, it's like, take a look at, you know, the closer you are to like a white or like whiteness, the safer you are, right? And this is seen in the schools, right, where you see Latinos that are predominantly white, or closer to whiteness, you know, like targeting recently arrived minors, right, that are coming from, whether that be Central America or Mexico itself. But here at One Community Action, we really try and strive for working within the high school, so that then we can support and provide that social emotional connectedness with our students. You know, a lot of the times we don't have access to therapists. We don't have access to even healthcare, right? Because who is helping our parents fill out those papers? Well, it's ourselves, right? And sometimes when you're 12, you can't fill out like government documents, right? And so we see that, you know, the efforts that, for example, MyCop is doing in the Central Coast on a campaign that they're starting in Oxnard that's called No Me Llaves Oaxaquita, which is, you know, what we see here in the Central Coast, that if you're brown, you're going to be called a Oaxaquita, right? And Oaxaquita is a term coming from, again, like the state of Oaxaca that is predominantly indigenous, that even if you're not indigenous yourself, but if you're brown, you're going to be called Oaxaquita, and you're going to be bullied, and you're going to be made fun of, right? And that's the reality that youth who are even barely migrating are facing. So I work with youth who are Latinos, but I also work with youth who are recently arrival minors. And there's been times where we've had to take them to school, right? Because even like in the school bell, right, before school starts, we have to wait in line with them to get to their classroom, because there is that bullying, right? And something that, you know, Connie mentioned as well that they're doing, I think it really is like our own community hurting itself, so that we can then have that prize that we're whiter, right? Or who's the whitest. Even me, who, you know, I'm not that brown, but like I was called Oaxaquita growing up, right? My siblings were, or my cousins were, or my own friends. And you see this where youth are having trouble with connecting with their peers, because there is that turn of events where, oh, they're making fun of my friend now, so let me go make fun of that friend as well, so that I don't get bullied, right? Because it's easier for me to navigate school like that. And so in the long term, that really does turn into gun violence. That does turn into drug abuse problems. That does turn into ending up in jail, which is what we see our youth, being pushed into that path, right? And here in OCA, we are really strong advocates on ethnic studies. We have seen that when youth, even if they're not Indigenous themselves, or if they're not Latino themselves, when they're able to see that other person's or their peers' cultural background, they really do start to understand, right, what life is as a brown person, what life is as a Black person. Although we can't 100%, experience those things ourselves, whether that be the hatred or the joy of being Black or brown, they are able to connect with them in the sense that, be proud of yourself because this is your history, right? Or be proud of yourself because your future is really bright, right? And so, yeah, there's just a lot of colorism and racism that's embedded within the Latino culture itself that, really disconnects us from being a community, right? And it saddens me, that Connie, as a Black woman and that works with a lot of Black youth in the Santa Barbara County, we're in the same county, right? And we're each worried about our own struggles, right? That we can't even connect to the joy because our struggles are so big, right? And so how do we do that? We reach out to each other, which is, Connie, I'll reach out to you later, but we reach out to each other. Even though we're from the same county, we're not experiencing the same things, right? Like Santa Barbara for us here in the Valley is seen as oh my gosh, it's so rich, it's so liberal, but in reality, it's not, right? Because when we take youth to field trips in Santa Barbara, we're being followed around in the stores, so now I can't even bear to imagine what's happening to youth, Black and brown youth actually living in Santa Barbara County. And although this is pretty gloomy, I am so hopeful, and here at OCA we are so hopeful for the changes we're making and for youth who are reconnecting or relearning what it is to be proud of themselves and where they come from, to be able to then express themselves and take that to empower other youth, when they're no longer youth. We see a lot of people who have gone through the same struggles that youth are going through today, who have come back and stayed with their community, and are now teaching them, right, that here are some breathing exercises that I learned in college, and let me teach you. And that's really impactful, right? Because when youth are able to now express themselves in healthy ways, they are now able to care for themselves in healthy ways, right? And care for their families in healthy ways. And even little things as setting a boundary. As a youth, there are no such thing as boundaries, right? Because you are if you're a woman, you're seen to serve the boys or men in your family. If you're a boy, you're seen to work and provide for your family monetarily, right? And so we are really restructuring what it is to be Latino. We are really restructuring what it is to be Indigenous in connecting with our ancestral ways, but also welcoming everyone to learn those ways, right? Regardless of whether they're Latino or not, regardless of whether they're Indigenous or not, to come into our space and understand, right? Because you can be lower income and still be facing the same or similar things as me, right? And so again, it's not a white versus them thing. It's middle higher class versus us thing, right? Because at the end of the day, we see white youth also falling into substance use disorder as well.
Thank you, Anahí, for that wonderful, insightful overview. We now have 10 minutes, which is way too little time. And thank you for all of you who've responded to questions. But I want to ask Mina, listening to you and to Anahí, both of you talk about the importance of education, and Anahí talked about the importance of ethnic studies. To what extent are you able to reach teachers in the schools you're looking at or involved with? To what extent are teachers responding positively, and or is it going to take more of a push from the community as a whole to get schools to provide representation and things like ethnic studies? How important are ethnic studies? Mina.
Yeah, I can actually speak to that a bit because some of the main push for AAPI Rising has been about trying to advocate for diverse histories in the classroom. And we've directly collaborated with a lot of teachers individually to basically we developed this presentation to highlight some of the main events in Asian American history that we feel weren't represented appropriately in classrooms. And it's called the One Day of AAPI History lesson. And we've taught it to like hundreds of classrooms at this point in many different states. And it's just as like an introduction to Asian American history, because we need to like break some of the stereotypes that have been formed about Asian Americans. And the way to do that is by teaching the histories that aren't represented. And specifically for the AAPI community, if people can see that we have played a significant role in American society, and if we have contributed so much to America, then we do actually belong here and we should be labeled as these perpetual foreigners. So to answer your question, we have worked with many teachers to get the One Day of AAPI History lesson out there, and it's actually available on our website. We made a video of it too. But we have seen a lot of teachers who are willing and who really want to have these stories included in their classrooms.
Okay.
So yeah,
Let
we've
me,
seen a lot of
let
that,
me
but yeah.
ask Anahí, to what extent have teachers been responsive, and do you see a increase in ethnic studies in northern Santa Barbara? And then I am going to go to our other three speakers.
Yeah, so here in Santa Maria, starting 2025, ethnic studies is now going to be an A through G requirement, which was a huge push and a huge win for us here in Santa Maria, and with great efforts of teachers and community members and students. I myself was a part of that back in 2000. I believe it passed in 2019 or 2020.
Okay.
And so now we're talking in the works of there's a curriculum that passed in California for ethnic studies just recently, and now we hope to apply that into the elementaries, right? Because although a lot of community services are based for high schoolers, there is a huge need in elementary, right? Because all that trauma starts in elementary. And we have really responsive teachers, but also we are trying to navigate how do we ourselves respond to the negativity of neighboring cities in northern Santa Barbara that are so against
Okay.
those things.
I think Miss Alexander, you wanted to comment on ethnic studies, and then
So
wrap up.
so what she's saying about Santa Barbara County is really deep. So the fight for ethnic studies in all of our schools, we had such tremendous pushback. So we had a group of student organizers, 2015, 2016, Ethnic Studies Now, they were a club, but we now have parents trying to figure out how to take their kids out of the ethnic studies classes. So it's a 9th grade combo in our county where it's taught as a part of 9th grade English. And we now have parents trying to take their kids out of that class or figure out how not to be in the class so that they don't actually have to hear it. And even the bill that was signed on ethnic studies, it doesn't go deep enough. There was a lot of pushback from us, from the Black African American community, about the things that were taken out of that bill. And we have to really talk about what got taken out of that bill. And so now our push is we want this to start at TK. We need to start this at TK. We're way too late by the time we get to high school to be able to really do any of this. TK ethnic studies.
Okay. I have a question now for Becky and Dashka. Are we taking bullying seriously enough? Your comments, Becky, about the fact that this is actually in law behavior that qualifies as criminal in some instances, but that they're real. I was unaware of that.
Well, to be clear, I think so. Some forms of bullying are acts of hate, and some acts of hate are criminal. I mean, I was talking to President Alexander. She described an assault on a student. Assaulting a student is a crime. there are civil rights violations, though, to be clear. So there's, crimes, and then there's also other forms of civil rights protections. So I was also referring to the fact that in some cases, when people are targeted for discrimination and harassment, when they cannot go to school free from harassment, that indeed does implicate civil rights laws, civil rights laws. So, people use the term crime a little bit too loosely. And I honestly think people use the term bullying in a very broad way. What you have heard today from Anahí, from Connie, from Mina, in the work that you heard from Dashka, these are civil rights violations. And again, I can say that from now until whenever, but the reality is it only matters if we can make sure that students can enforce those civil rights. So it is important to recognize that there are civil rights violations, but we are obliged at the state level to make sure that those rights are enforceable. So I also just think I just have to say that I have so much respect for the work that people have been doing to push for ethnic studies. I work on hate crimes. We cannot address hate if we are not able to honestly reckon with our ongoing history of racism and discrimination in this country. And we will not be able to do so if we are not raising a generation of people who actually understand what the truth looks like. And that is all that ethnic studies is trying to do. So so I think I just wanted to be really clear. Not all forms of bullying are necessarily civil rights violations, but the kinds of bullying we're talking about constitute unlawful discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, and disability. So that is where we have civil rights violations. They may be civil rights violations and not criminal, but I don't want us to overlook what we're hearing about assaults and other crimes.
Thank you. And Dashka, your sense of how much are we kind of shrugging and saying bullying happens, but what we've heard today, and as Becky is saying, it's not only unlawful discrimination, but it also plants seeds that lead and foster both a tremendous loss of respect on the part of those bullied, and in some ways on the part of the bullier. Are we taking it seriously enough? And would you recommend more of us in journalism listen to young people and try to scope out what the landscape of bullying they're experiencing actually is?
I think it's really important to sort of parse this question a bit. Bullying has, and incidents of hate, racial discrimination, like the full, spectrum of these kinds of identity-based negative experiences, like wherever they lie on that spectrum of, from criminal to, civil rights and everything in between. Those have an impact. We know that is true for students. We know, the students that I wrote about, anxiety, depression, a disengagement from school, stereotype threat, which is when kids become unable to do their schoolwork because they have a voice in their head that says, you won't be good at this because of who you are. All of those things have an impact. So absolutely, we have to take that seriously. And absolutely, we have to do the work all the way through the school experience to not just educate the students about the long, long history of racism in this country and all the different identities that have been targeted by that, but also uplifting communities by telling the stories of their triumphs and their achievements. I think one of the places that things often go wrong is that kids kind of hear this long litany of all the terrible things that have been done, and kids of color don't hear enough about the joys and the achievements. And that contributes to school culture as well.
Thank you.
Can I just say one more thing, though? That I think we get caught up in the sort of a punitive lens, which is how we deal with every problem in this country, which is that we are going to use the law, we are going to use the criminal justice system to deal with every problem that we have. And this is a extremely failed process. The same people who have been marginalized by the criminal justice system are not likely to be helped by it. And so this idea that, we're going to punish our way out of bullying, I think is really misguided. And so a lot of the work has to be done with school cultures, with uplifting identities, with restorative justice, and helping kids work their way back when they have caused harm. And so I would love to see reporters to be diving deeper and not just looking at how can, did kid get expelled? Did kid get suspended? Because that very rarely solves the problem. Every kid that does the worst thing is just the canary in the coal mine. There are many, many other kids who are doing a lesser version of that. And the school culture remains unchanged when we only try to punish our way out.
And I would just say that a lot of the civil rights enforcement is not about punishing students, it's about holding schools accountable, just to be clear.
Well, this is a tremendous and so valuable session for all of us in the business of reporting on and for the Stop the Hate initiative. But for those reporters not in California, many of our reporters come from all over the country. I think these remarks have been a call to action to look at what's happening with bullying in the schools, take seriously the responsibilities schools have, but even more so, the responsibilities in communities to identify, explain, and give voice, especially to the young people who are speaking out, like Mina and Anahí, and help provide a wider awareness of the everyday life. And I would just conclude with what Connie said about the young man who was bullied this week in Santa Barbara. His mother went to the school board to report what had happened and unfortunately wound up with only 90 seconds to speak because teachers were pushing, as is their right, for higher wages. So there was no time for her. But now the risk is this young kid, this young student, is going to be identified as a snitch because his mother spoke out. So this is where I feel we can play as reporters such an important role in validating young people's experiences and also what young people like Mina and Anahí are doing to try to support and address the situations they're encountering. I didn't hear in any of the speakers a kind of blame game. I heard a cry to help better understand the everyday realities students are facing and the need to pay more attention and to hold schools accountable as opposed to call in the police and use the criminal justice system. So thank you for a tremendously revealing session. I think Dashka's comments, which everybody echoed about the importance, I think Mina referred to how anonymous and invisible you can be and how empowering that can encourage greater bullying. The kind of invisibility of some of the key factors driving bullying in these schools, Dashka, as you were identifying, happening online. So it's a very complex landscape, not just what is visible in the schools, but what is visible online. very big task for us as journalists. Thank you very much for helping us understand the complexities and urgencies of this issue. Our conference is now closed, but we will be sending contact information for our speakers, along with a recording of today's conference to all our participants. Thank you again.